Hey class, it's Mr. Dow, and I just wanted to have a brief video chat with everybody here to kind of talk about the stories that I assigned this week and talk about why I assigned those specific stories. Before I do that, let's check in with the class dog, see what he's doing. Okay, there's Crypto. He's doing what he always does, so everything's fine. So last week we learned the most basic elements of any of short story analysis, which is what is the plot structure, who is the protagonist and antagonist, what are the conflicts, and then a little bit about what is the character psychology. Now that's a great place to start, and it can tell you a lot about that. Just looking at those things can tell you a lot about most stories. But there are other elements to look at, and that's kind of what this week is about. So I assigned the 3 stories because each one of them kind of leads you into some of the other elements which are become more helpful than just character and plot. So what I'll do is I'll talk about each of those stories briefly using the terms from last week, and then tell you why I picked them for this week and what new elements that are important to understanding them. With the lottery, surely one of the most famous stories ever written in the English language. It's in more short story collections than any other story in history. So I'd be surprised if you haven't already read The Lottery at some point. Now with The Lottery, though, if you're trying to look for basic things like, okay, what's the conflict here? Who's the protagonist? Who's the antagonist? What's the climax? It sort of doesn't help you that much because it's kind of an oddly told story. Let's start with just plot structure. That's a story where the conflict is not that clear to me. I'm sort of following Tessie Hutchinson. I don't sense that she has any problem. I don't even sense a problem in the story until maybe a third of the way in there when I start to get the feeling that these people are not looking forward to the lottery. There's something with going up with the lottery that it's not a pleasant experience in some way. And really the climax of the story is the last sentence when the people fall on Tessie and start throwing rocks at her. There is no falling action. There is no resolution to that story. So Tessie is at the center of the story because she gets picked, but I don't know if I'm comfortable calling her the protagonist because I'm not sure the conflict is really hers. I know she's going to get picked and she doesn't want to be picked, but at the same time, the authors made specific choices to kind of push me away from Tessie, which in our other stories, the authors didn't do that. The authors wanted me to know who the protagonist was and to identify them with that protagonist at some level, but not in this story. Like I said, there are things that kind of wall me up away from Tessie Hutchinson. So it's not that easy to follow what they're trying to get across with her. And I don't really know much about Tessie, psychologically, because, and this is one of the things the author chooses to do, I never go into Tessie's mind. I never know what she's thinking or what she's feeling. I really don't know what anyone in this town is thinking or feeling. I see what they do. I hear what they say. But it's kind of like watching a play or even a movie, just that I'm removed. That's called objective point of view, and that is one of the things that I would have to look at to really understand this story pretty well. I think this story is more theme-oriented probably than the other stories, where I think Jackson had a pretty big point she wanted to make, so she concocted a story around that point. To understand the story, I wouldn't throw out character and plot, but I think this is one of the stories I have to look at the use of that specific objective point of view, which is kind of a rare point of view. The story doesn't come from anybody. It comes from a very far-removed narrator. I probably would look at the narrative structure a little bit, or the narrative style. She makes a lot of interesting choices. The people are so bland and nice, and the town is nice. I'd look at the setting of this story because it's very clearly, this is America. Everybody's named something like Adams or Summers or Graves. A lot of people think, oh, the story is set a long time ago. It's not. It's a pretty modern story. The men talk of tractors and taxes. This story is like 1930, 1940, middle of New England, small towns. So, those are deliberate choices because when it gets to the horrible thing that these people do, I think Jackson does not want us to she doesn't want us to separate ourselves from it. She doesn't want us to be able to say something like, oh, well, it's those people in that crazy mountaintop village in Irkutsk. Of course they're going to act that way. She says, no, this is average, nice people in America. That's who this story is about. And I think that that and the use of irony, in the end, I think she's trying to get across a pretty big idea that about where morality comes from and how much morality is tied into the idea of community, which when you start thinking about it is kind of disturbing because I think she's implying that had you yourself grown up in that village where they held the lottery and you were 10 years old and they gave you a rock to throw at your mother who'd been selected, I think Jackson's implying that you would throw that rock at your mother's head, which isn't pleasant. Maybe you want to argue with it, but our job isn't to judge the author's theme, at least not right away. Our job is first to figure out what is the author's theme, what is your point? But to get to the point, Jackson does use more than just the character and the plot. She's kind of manipulating those things a little bit. And when it comes down to who is the protagonist, I don't, because Tessie Hutchinson never steps up and objects to the morality of the lottery, she doesn't voice my objection to it. Nobody does in the whole story. So I don't think there is a real protagonist here. I think the town is all together. They're all pro-lottery. They just don't want to get picked. And that's a weird situation for a story, but that's one of the reasons you have to move to other terms to really get to the bottom of that story. That's why we have those this week. Now, in Hills Like White Elephants, you have a situation where it's easier to tell there's a conflict. I can tell in the first few sentences this couple is having an argument. I get that. So there's a conflict, and as it goes on, I think the girl, it becomes more the protagonist than the man does. And I say that because I think the man is sort of bullying the girl to do something he wants her to do, even though he won't say what it is, nor will he actually say what it is he wants her to do, or even that he does want her to do it. But because Hemingway's a good writer, and I've been around couples before, I get the sense, the rhythm of this conversation. I get it. He's trying to push her into doing this. And the girl is trying to not do what he wants her to do, but she's not standing up to him. She's more sort of maneuvering back and forth. So after a while, I feel bad for her. And so, okay, she's my protagonist. But again, just like with the lottery, the choice of point of view, which is objective again. I get no thoughts, no feelings. I don't know much about the internal life of either of these characters. Because of that choice of point of view, it's just not easy to pick up on who the good guy or the bad guy is. The author's deliberately chosen to cut off an area of information that I normally get in other stories. And then I think narrative style is important here because that's an odd style. I look at that story and it's just little short, choppy pieces of dialogue, very different than other stories. And they go on and on and on, and the dialogue isn't about anything particularly important. And then at certain places, the dialogue stops, and I get some landscape description, or the character does something, takes an action that doesn't seem necessary, but, invites me to interpret it in some way. So I think with the point of view and that narrative style, that leads me to the biggest reason this story is included is that it relies heavily on symbolism. To fully understand what's happening in the story, I kind of have to go back and look at those landscape settings and think about when the girl walks for no reason, gets up and walks to the other end of the railway station, and she looks at that side of the station and it's described for you in detail. And I think, wait a minute, what was on the first side of the station? Oh, yeah, in the first paragraph, they talk about that. Oh, they're so different. They're very different. And I think, there's the railway station. There's a choice coming up. And that's, okay, then that helps me interpret what the story is really about and kind of where it's going. So it's another story that where the use of other literary terms besides character and plot are really helpful. In Story of an Hour by Catherine Mansfield, I know my protagonist. That's easy because it's such a short story. Of course, Mrs. Mallard is the person I'm with. But the conflict is odd because, you would think she's told her husband has died, and then in the first few minutes she grieves for him, and you'd think this is a story about her grieving for her husband, but she goes right upstairs, locks herself in a room, and as she's sitting there in a chair, kind of waiting to feel worse, she stops feeling bad and starts feeling better because she starts thinking about how she now is kind of free. And from everything we learned about the husband, he's not an antagonist in the sense that he was a terrible guy, but he's kind of he's an antagonist in the sense that he was standing between her and this idea that she actually would enjoy being free and being able to do what she wanted to do. So now this story, I think, to really understand it, we have to go past character and plot and kind of get into first setting. I don't think the story makes sense if it's told in Glendora in 2018. I think it does make sense if it's told in the year 1900 in Middletown, America, when women's options are so limited that marrying somebody you might not necessarily love all the time is still a pretty good. It's kind of it's an option you have to consider seriously, and many women did that. With that setting in mind, I sort of understand the problem Mrs. Mallard is having. Also, the story is just rich in irony. The whole story is so based on irony and just and sort of seeing that your expectations are reversed and people completely misinterpret something because they don't have information that you, the reader, has. And the irony itself ends up kind of helping to make a point, which is just like all of these literary terms do that. In each case, what's happening is that the author has chosen to write a non-standard story. So it's stories that are not like Most Dangerous Game, where Most Dangerous Game is a pretty, it's a good story, but it's so typical. It goes from A to B to C to D, a linear plot, and the writing is very standard, and there aren't any real big surprises there. These writers of these three stories have chosen to take a different route, which means that other literary elements have to be looked at for us to really appreciate the stories and for us to fully understand the themes. So that's just a taste of what's going on in those stories. You know, I've got more to say about each of those things. I want you to read the essay on this week's module about each of those literary terms, kind of learn a little bit more about them. And we will be working with them in paper number 3, which comes up this week. All right, that's all for now. I'll stop it there. That was a pretty long video chat. Let's go back to Crypto, see how he's doing. Oh, you put your bone on me, huh? That's a good move. Good move, Crypto. Okay, that means something. Okay. All right, everybody. See you later. Bye.